Okay, wonderful. So welcome, hello. My name is April Dean. I'm the Executive Director at SNAP. As I mentioned, we're recording this presentation. It's really helpful and wonderful if you can all remain on mute during Andrew's presentation. If you accidentally come off mute, I might mute you. Please don't be offended. It's just so everyone can hear the presentation. And then after the presentation, you're so welcome to unmute and join in the conversation or continue to use the chat function throughout the Q&A as you're comfortable. In opening, I would like to acknowledge with gratitude and a sense of responsibility that SNAP is located on traditional lands referred to as Treaty 6 territory in Amiskitchi-Waskahigan, the Cree name for this place, which means Beaver Mountain House. All the people here are the intended beneficiaries of this peace and friendship treaty. Treaty 6 encompasses the traditional and present-day territories of numerous First Nations and the Métis people. SNAP is dedicated to ensuring that the spirit of Treaty 6 is honored and respected through our governance, our values, and most importantly, in our relations with artists and within our community. We offer this land acknowledgement not as an erasure of historical and ongoing colonial violence, but as a reminder of our responsibility to an equitable future. The gratitude we feel to this land and its First Peoples should extend to better action. And so in honor of June being Pride Month and tomorrow, June 20th, being Indigenous Peoples Day, Treaty 6 Outreach, which is a local community outreach and mutual aid network, is planning a Treaty 6 Pride event next week to celebrate queer kin in our community. They've put out a request for colorful clothing, new makeup, glitter, and other rainbow or pride swag, and you can connect with Treaty 6 Outreach directly over Instagram. I'll add their contact information to the chat here directly. You can also directly support Treaty 6 through a donation by making a direct fund transfer from your bank account to theirs. And you can send that to treaty6outreach@gmail.com. The 6 is a letter, not a word. I will add that to the chat as well. Give me one moment here to copy and paste. As we continue to gather digitally and across Turtle Island, I would also like to extend an invitation to those in other traditional or treaty territories, or those living on unceded and occupied lands, to share in this feeling of gratitude and to join in extending that gratitude to better action. Now it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce Andrew Testa. Andrew is an artist, writer, and educator working through printmaking, drawing, books, words, sounds, installations, and collaborations, living and working in Uktahamguk. Did I do terrible at that, Andrew? Was that okay? Thank you. Also known as Newfoundland. He has been awarded Arts Newfoundland, SSHRC, and the Elizabeth Greenshields Foundation grant for his research. Andrew has exhibited nationally and internationally and has participated in residencies and conferences across Canada. Testa is the chair of the board of directors at St. Michael's Print Shop and is a visiting assistant professor at Grenfell Campus, Memorial University of Newfoundland. Andrew completed his BFA and MFA at York University in Toronto. Andrew would also like to acknowledge and thank Arts Newfoundland for their generous support of this project. And in turn, SNAP is grateful for the financial support of our funders, the EAC, the City of Edmonton, the Alberta Foundation for the Arts, and the Canada Council for the Arts in making our programs possible. Thank you for bearing with me through that intro, and please join me in welcoming Andrew Testa.
Thank you so much, April. And thank you, SNAP, and everyone there who helped with the install and took part in that. I really, really appreciate that. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so we're good to go. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to see so many friendly faces and new ones. And thank you, SNAP, for inviting me to share about my art practice. So before I begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm joining from Almastagwek on the island of Ukdunguk, also known as the Bay of Islands, Newfoundland. The land from which I'm speaking, sharing, and reflecting is in traditional Mi'kmaq territory, and I acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. And it's important to keep in mind in remote artist talks like this one, and April touched upon this as well, that folks are joining from various places, and that I ask that you reflect upon, acknowledge, and respect the traditional territories and diverse histories and cultures of where local is to you. And thank you, April, for the introduction and for the land acknowledgement. So my name is Andrew Testa. I'm an artist, writer, educator, community art activist, and an amateur spoon carver. And before I begin to talk about, let's see, there we go. Before I begin to talk about my practice, I want to kind of reflect upon the method for how I work with things opposed to create a study of things. So these are the kind of the methods that underline the entirety of my artistic practice. So the first is thinking through this idea from the anthropologist Tim Ingold and his ideas of correspondence or mutual responsiveness. And the second method is thinking through the sociologist George Lipschitz and his ideas of improvisation or collaboration, contribution, and community. So what is mutual responsiveness, or what I like to refer to as thinking with things as soft surfaces? So Tim Ingold, he often speaks about kind of the breakthroughs that occur in the areas like the sciences. So there's something someone is trying to understand further, and a breakthrough kind of happens when you shatter the surface of something, so it reveals its secrets. And there's a great attention to objectivity in this regard, as the researcher should almost be at an arm's length from the thing of study itself. So the researcher is, in a sense, kind of unchanged from this encounter, but has a greater understanding of the thing through this breaking of a figurative surface. What the mutual responsiveness speaks towards is thinking of everything as soft surfaces, opposed to hard surfaces that need to kind of be broken through. So one way to think about this is if everything was a sponge. And they're all pushing up against other sponges. And there's a sort of momentary kind of mutual impressions that can be left upon one another when these soft surfaces come together. So I'm a soft surface. The things that I'm interacting with and participating alongside are soft surfaces too. And to study with them, opposed to kind of creating the study of them, there's a suggestion that all soft surfaces can leave an imprint on one another. In this way, you're no longer at an arm's reach from a thing, but you rather move alongside and with the things you're corresponding to. So it brings to attention the responsiveness all things have to one another, and the responsibilities all things have to one another, and their ability to kind of imprint on the things that are encountered. And part of the reason why I'm so drawn to this, I think, is as someone who works primarily through printmaking, is that print for me is really kind of an exploration of soft surfaces. Print is kind of the moments in between two things coming together. Print is an in-between. And this can refer to kind of traditional print mediums like intaglio or relief, where there's a matrix that's literally being like pushed up against a substrate, and the resulting image is kind of the residue of this encounter. But it also speaks to something, what I like to call being printerly. So working in a printerly manner, which is the method for me that kind of expands beyond printmaking into interdisciplinary spaces, is a way then to kind of investigate the mutual responsiveness or the squishiness or the soft surfaces between these things. So to be printerly is then to encounter the world, thinking through the residues, the imprints, the brief or long encounters between two or more soft surfaces. Now, in improvisation, there's a similar thinking in terms of the mutual responsiveness between things, but there's an emphasis on collaboration, community, and contribution to something larger than the self. So when George Lipschitz talks about improvisation, he's often coming to it from kind of the perspective of music. So the point of interest for me is in how Lipschitz approaches or prioritizes the act of listening as integral to the role of improvising. So when I think of improvising, I think of playing music growing up. And I found when I was playing music, I found improvising very difficult. But it was something that I was able to gradually learn to get better at. And at the time, I thought, or I assumed that in order to improvise better, it was only a matter of kind of increasing my skill set, essentially knowing how to show off when you were called upon. But what I came to slowly understand was that to improvise better, you must first sit back and listen to what you are a part of. you have to be patient, you have to not speak and let others speak, and move along with others through this act of listening, a sort of playing without making noise. So Lipschitz talks a lot about this in relationship to how a rhythm section in a jazz band plays. He sees them as a supporting role that's an accompaniment. And he talks about this idea of improvisation as something that emphasizes and develops the capacity for attention and empathy of a whole. So Lipschitz suggests that if you want to speak, you have to first listen, and sometimes listening is a form of speaking. So with this basis of method, a grounding of kind of in soft surfaces that kind of mutually correspond to one another, and improvisation as a form of listening and supporting a larger whole, I wanted to introduce kind of the general interest that I have within my practice, which this exhibition starts to explore. So the first is the agency of processes, materials, and other than human things. The second is the presentation and performance of research creation or art practices, and specifically kind of thinking through accessibility and inclusivity. And the third is community engaged art practices with an emphasis on knowledge sharing and experience making. And all these research interests of mine kind of encompass this idea of what it means to be printerly. And again, printerly as a manner of how I come to see, experience, and understand what is around me. So all of these research interests, they mingle endlessly and cannot be easily separated. But for the sake of this artist talk, I want to introduce them as individual headings to view a particular body or collection of work through. So in this case, the collection of work that we're going to look at is what's currently on display at SNAP. And the question that I'm asking within this exhibition, or the main question that I'm asking, is what does a mutual and nurturing conversation with the other than human look like? And what would the ethics of that be? And in my investigation, the start of it, I was thinking a lot about language. And when I think about language, I often come to stones as kind of this counterpart to begin that process. And there are other times, though, that like ground, bird, trees, et cetera, are kind of sought too. But for the most part, stones become this initial kind of grounding. And then early beginning to thinking about language was learning the names of everything that I encountered. So something that I tried and ultimately failed at during a residency in 2019 in Port Union at Union House Arts, which is a place out in Newfoundland. And at this time, and what I continue to think a lot about is Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, Braiding Sweetgrass. So Kimmerer is an Indigenous scientist and educator. And in her text, she speaks about teaching her students, she says, to quote, be bilingual between the lexicon of science and the grammar of animacy, end quote. So in this sense, there's kind of this moving between perspectives and vantage points. There is her Indigenous lens that she is seeing through, the animacy of things, a grounding towards something not as objects of study, but rather things that have agency, a communing of subjects, not a collection of objects. And for me, as an uninvited guest in traditional Mi'kmaq territory, I wanted to try to learn the names of things that I passed. So again, thinking of the grammar of things and how to develop what this language may be. So I'd say my name and their name in return. And it was kind of this shaking hands of sorts, this initial introduction. And I saw this as a starting point for a conversation between two speaking things, an attempt to become courteous to the place and space that I was in. But I was not and am not ready to name in such a manner. I figured as I kind of went through this, what I learned was I needed to first start by listening. So thinking about kind of George Lipschitz and his ideas of improvisation, and what does it mean to really kind of propel and support the ecology of things that you're a part of, and listening as one of the priorities within that, opposed to thinking that I was ready to name to begin with. So thinking of improvisation, how do you play the supporting role to what is around you? Well, you listen, you learn, and you begin to develop a lifelong commitment to not an understanding, as I don't think I could ever understand from the perspective of another, but rather an awareness and respect of the places and spaces I am in and how they participate in the ecology of things in which they are a part. So in a book called Learning to Die, Wisdom in the Age of Climate Crisis by Robert Bringhurst and Jan Zwicky, Bringhurst begins the first chapter by speaking about humans as liminal creatures. He says, quote, "We often get closer to the wild by pushing against it. brushing out a trail, or catching and cleaning a trout, end quote. But is this manner of kind of pushing up against things okay to do? It's really easy to kind of push too quickly or push too hard. In the same breath, Bringhurst goes on to say, quote, if you look closely enough, you may find it impossible to identify any animal, plant, fungus, or even bacterium that doesn't in some degree manipulate and modify the nearby environment to better suit its needs. The wild, you can say, is a big self-integrating system whose edges are everywhere and whose center is nowhere, end quote. So in this manner, we as liminal creatures can kind of participate in these interconnected conversations. But there's a responsibility to be aware of our own edges, the edges of others that we push up to, and the fact that the center, which is often quickly assumed to be human, is in fact nowhere. So there's kind of this decentralizing that's going on. And instead of decentralizing to find a new center, it's the acknowledgement that there is no center to begin with. So to further upon the question that I'm asking within this exhibition, to listen to a stone, for example, is it matter of being a stone, or at the very least being less me? And then how does one become less of themselves? And how does one listen and eventually speak to the other than human as a human, but in a space and language that is also other than human? And what does this language or languages look like, kind of thinking back to what I was talking about earlier? So the simple answer when it comes to thinking about language is that I don't know what it looks like. And I don't think I'll ever know wholly. But I can begin the process of listening, experiencing, and participating as a soft surface and an accompaniment to begin to try to know humbly. So looking towards things, processes, materials as participatory acting collaborators, I began kind of creating these instances that allowed a space for the possibility of language to occur in a printerly manner, or perhaps instead of allowing a language to occur, making myself aware of the nuanced languages that are already occurring and kind of bringing myself to a place where I can recognize those instances. So here I dragged plates upon walks to see what a walks language may be. And one thing that's important to note is that I'm not looking for a language that makes sense to me in terms of kind of understanding, but rather one that is spoken by the soft surfaces together in a way that those surfaces see fit. So the same way that the language of a guitar and a trumpet, for instance, can speak to one another, but their sounds don't equate to a specific word or series of words, but rather there are other forms of shared communications that can be experienced. So it's interesting to note that when I repeat these walks, so I'll take a plate for a walk and go for a series and set of walks. No two walks ever really record in the same way, even if the ground or space felt very similar. Each was entirely individual and unique to the circumstances of its own happening. And just to speak a little bit about the process of making these, so each plate, each intaglio plate, so these were zinc plates, were dragged after being coated in hard ground. And then I etched them and then put an aquatint on and etched them again and printed them with a top roll, which is the degradés that you see. And then I also inked the string and printed the string that was used to drag the plate to begin with. And moving on from this body of work to another work that exists in the exhibition, this is a kind of a residue series. I started collecting the residue. So I was looking for what does a walks language look like in another capacity. So I began collecting the residue of a walk by brushing off the things that came home with me from my shoe. So when I would go for a walk and come back, I would come back home, take off my shoes and brush off any of the residue from that walk and kind of start to keep that. And I would do this process kind of over and over. And as this continued, what I started to notice was that my home started speaking to the residue. There was a conversation that was forming between the things from within my home as well as the residue. So for instance, the cat fur, hair, and dust would join in on the rug that I was kind of collecting these residues. And there was this eventual conversation of things kind of both inside and out. And so I would take the residue and bring them into the dark room. And then what I would do is I would produce a photogram using ortholithofilm. The particular image here was a walk that I took in the winter. This was a planned one where I kind of as soon as I collected the residue, it went into the freezer, and then I brought what was in the freezer into the darkroom and tried to create a photogram pretty quick before everything melted. But I would bring it in, expose it to the film, develop it, and then use that as a film to expose to a photopolymer gravure plate, and then later print that. And I would also print a degradé layer behind the photopolymer image. And the degradé layer was another photopolymer print where I just developed the aquatint screen and then inked that up with a degradé and printed that first. So now moving on to something that isn't in this exhibition, but still is exploring this idea of kind of this notion of language and what language may occur, and kind of creating these awkward series of plunges into trying to investigating what this is. There was this series of watercolors that I made. And this was from a collection of stones that I collected, or rather borrowed. So when I talk about collecting things, when I collect them and gather them from where I am, I often make notes of where I kind of borrow them from. And then when I'm finished with them, I'll bring them back to that place, because I don't feel I have the right to kind of keep them longer than the time that I need them in, and trying to converse with them. So in this case, it was a series of rocks that I had that I would bring with me in my pockets. And what I would notice is that, kind of without my asking, but with my pleasant surprise, the rocks started conversing with the other things that were in my pockets. So my puffer, my keys, my change, wallet would kind of leave traces on the rocks. And this then resulted in kind of this ongoing and slowly growing collection of images of watercolors, where I create a watercolor study of the rock prior to kind of entering my pocket, and then a graphite study of kind of recording and looking at the intimate encounters of the things that were left within my pocket and how they converse with the stone itself, before then returning the stone to kind of where I gathered it from. And again, even though this isn't print, it's a very printerly exploration for me. It's an exploration of soft surfaces and how they kind of encounter one another and affect one another. So lastly, something that is a part of this show is a series of Xerox books that I have. And a lot of times when I go out and kind of gather or borrow things, sometimes they don't end up in my pockets, or they're not the things that get dragged or exposed to the photograms. But there's a series of things that I'm just trying to get to know the place and borrow them for a short period of time. And eventually I made these Xerox books from them. And these lo-fi quality of their kind of their traces and details, it's a shadow of sorts of the particularness that I was really interested in. But what would happen is as I kind of Xerox these collections and then eventually started folding those together and creating these books, there would be these gentle collisions with other recordings from the pages. And what I was really interested in here is that I was not only interested in kind of the language and the conversation between me and these other than human things upon the initial gathering, but then even in the recording of it, there were these new conversations that were taking place between these gentle collisions between pages. And there was this extension of conversation and new conversations that were taking place. So a further opportunity for me to listen even after I brought these things kind of back to where they were gathered from. So each of these instances is kind of this series of awkward plunges into an attempt of a cohesive whole of what language and conversation may be. But even more interestingly, for me, each process, whether it's in intaglio or photograms or photopolymers, drawings and watercolors and Xerox, each of these things kind of share their own set of languages, their own set of agency, and how they relate and communicate these encounters. So these works are then in part an attempt of me listening and improvising while working with and learning to learn from the other than human things that I'm kind of conversing with, but also how I learn to learn and participate with the processes and materials that I'm using to kind of engage myself in these conversations. So it's coming to know how to listen and converse in this regard. This becomes this very kind of individual and internal thing. It's very much about me in relationship to these things that I'm kind of taking part with. But moving on to the next area of interest, what happens when I want to converse about these things with others? So thinking about the presentation and performance of this research creation or this artistic practice. And Specifically, again, thinking through what it means to prioritize accessibility and inclusivity, especially when these conversations are often kind of speculative in nature. So when I think about where these conversations exist beyond kind of the initial conversation with the other than human things and the processes and materials, there's the spaces like the gallery, for instance, where where the work is shown today. But there's also conferences that I present in and writings and publications and things like that. And I recognize that these spaces are incredibly privileged spaces to show work in a gallery, to present in a conference, in universities and things of that nature. These are all very privileged spaces to take part in. And I'm curious about, well, how else can I think about these conversations? How else can I create access points for these conversations to exist beyond those spaces? And it's not necessarily to kind of dismiss the importance of having such dialogues in these spaces, but rather thinking, where else can these conversations be? So I want to share an anecdote that kind of began this interest of mine, thinking about kind of the accessibility and inclusivity of my art practice. When I had my MFA thesis exhibition, my mom, who's here today, she came to the show and she turned to me and asked, she says, "You're going to have real art here too, right?" And I looked around at kind of my folded and crumpled images, the assemblages of prints that I had and various fragments kind of adorning the wall. And I responded, "This is real art, Mom." And I dismissed the comment that she made in the present, as I thought what she meant was like, where are all the landscapes and portraits? But as years passed, I kind of found myself coming back to her question. And it wasn't the notion of real art where kind of my mind wandered to when it coming back, but it was kind of dwelling in the much larger discourse of accessibility and inclusivity that she implied. So I'm going to re-ask the question I feel my mom actually asked. How am I and others supposed to understand any of this? And do I need an art education to do so? And is that fair? And to answer the last question, no, it's not fair to expect that an art education is needed to think through and respond to these artworks. So I needed to do better. And this kind of comes through when I'm working with my students and teaching my students, and specifically when we start getting into reading like art theory and things. I often tell them not to fret over the difficulties that they're inevitably going to face when kind of working through the pages. Because they often fall back to this kind of false realization that they're not, quote unquote, smart enough to understand what is being presented within these art theory books. But rather, in actuality, the texts are written in a way that denies accessibility. And that's the author's fault. It's not their fault. So thinking back to my mom's question, I realized that this was true of me too, and I needed to do better. So now I want to share a highlight of my artistic career, and it's not an exhibition or grant or even piece of artwork. It was a text I wrote, or rather a response to that text from my mom. And she read the text and she told me that she loved it as any mother would. But the highlight itself comes from when she went for a walk later that day after she read my text. And on that walk, she kicked a stone, and she stopped and she looked at the stone and she said, "Hello." And she thought about the stone and where it has come from and where it might go and what it was doing. And as she kind of continued on her walk, a lot of these kind of conversations started to follow. And when she got home, she called to tell me about kind of kicking the stone and talking to it and the things that she noticed and the things that she said. And this was really exciting to hear, and something that I was really interested with. And although I had an inkling that my process was kind of a place for accessibility, it really didn't jump out at me until that moment. So in my practice, I go for a lot of walks. I try to move slow. I try to be both noticed and unnoticed. I kick big stones along long walks. As part of my performative process at times, I'll pick up stones and carry them in my pockets. As you've seen in previous works, I drag intaglio plates behind me to record kind of conversations. I also find sit spots to try to outweight the birds so their alarm songs kind of return to song. And sometimes people kind of stare in these when I'm working through these performative processes, but there are other times when people kind of stop and ask questions. And the performance, these performative processes or these moments of oddness became a place where there was an invitation to conversation kind of outside the gallery, outside the university and the conference space. And this was really intriguing for me to kind of think through. So most times people ask, like, what are you doing and why are you doing it? And pleasant conversations usually follow. And in these instances of oddness, me dressed as quilting fabric that kind of looks like a comical version of my surroundings, I'm presenting myself in a manner that's inviting such small talk. So I prepare and kind of participate. And the performative process then is not only a conversation or an invitation to conversation with the other than human things that I'm participating with. So attempting to be as quiet as one can be, where I'm literally trying to blend in with the environment I'm taking part in. But it's also a way where I'm almost yelling and calling out to others to ask me questions and kind of participate in these conversations. So it's both a quietness and a loudness at kind of one and the same time. And there's a text called Sensing Botanical Sensoria by the anthropologist Natasha Myers. And in there she states, quote, "Here I invite you to cultivate your inner plant. This is not an exercise in anthropomorphism, a rendering of plants on the model of the human. Rather, it's an opportunity to vegetalize your already more than human body. In order to awaken the latent plant in you, you will need to get interested and involve the things the plant cares about," end quote. So when thinking of my camouflage, I'm not only trying to kind of call out for others for this conversation, but I'm simultaneously trying to kind of vegetalize my more than human body. In a sense, I'm attempting to kind of change my perspective, a perspective that comes through the other than human and not oneself. But although always kind of acknowledging that this perspective shift is seen and carried out through the veil of human experience. But how does one kind of change perspectives into something so removed from what one is? So for me, I think it's being interested and involved in the things that the other than human cares about. But what does a stone or a birch tree care about? So to begin this process, I would argue that you have to kind of sit with a birch, stone, or tree, wait with them, slow your thinking to the thinking of a stone or of a tree. But even if you can get to a place to know kind of what a stone cares about, how would you kind of stonify or vegetalize yourself further? Or is this process even enough to begin with, assuming that it can be done? Maria Puig de la Bellacasa, a theorist, in a book she has called Matters of Care, would argue that what it means to care is not to simply be able to care about something, but also to care for it. And she says, quote, "Care is required in processes in which humans and non-humans co-train each other to live, work, and play together, to construct a relationship of significant otherness," end quote. So the first process towards kind of this significant otherness is then an empathetic repositioning of one's perspective to that of the stone, which is then done kind of in addition to caring for the stone through the perspective of a human. So it's a crossing between these two spaces, the caring for the stone from the stone, as well as a caring about the stone through the perspective of oneself. This kind of attempt to co-train and live with each other. So the performance and presentation of the camouflage for me became a point of accessibility. The process of kind of becoming odd as a way to invite conversation on a walk while I'm kind of out and about, as well as a way to attempt to kind of care for a stone, for instance, from the attempted perspective of a stone by literally dressing up as it, which is something I enjoy doing quite a lot. So another instance of thinking through kind of the presentation and performance of my practice, specifically thinking of accessibility and inclusivity, was this series, which isn't a part of the exhibition at SNAP. And this is titled A Walk Repeated. And this was the first time I began working with plexi. And the plexi itself was kind of fun in this obnoxious kind of way as this material. And it allowed me to kind of explore these incredibly quiet and slow thoughts, but in this loud and inviting and fun method. And when I made the series, they were displayed outdoors in a night art festival in Cornbrook, Newfoundland, called CB Nuit. And when I displayed them, I noticed this young boy, the boy on the left picture there, and he was running between each side and kind of reading them out loud to his dad. And his dad would ask, "What's this one telling you?" And the boy would reply, well, I think this one's telling me to look and listen. And he would say, but what do I look for? And the dad responded with what's around us. And they'd look together kind of with these exaggerated gestures of hands sitting upon their brows, and eventually kind of point at something as they spotted something. And then the boy would say, well, what do we listen for? And then they would cup their ears and have these exaggerated gestures and turning to see kind of what sounds were around. And these signs were made similar to kind of the walking prints, where I would drag intaglio plates, digitize their scratches, laser engrave the scratches onto the signs, and then overlay text that was collected by me throughout those walks. And the text and kind of bright colors was this point of accessibility for me, and how the young boy kind of experienced the work and how he was able to respond to it. And they were odd and fun in a way that kind of called out, but also invited kind of this quiet participation. And for someone who often thinks about language within my work, particularly language that's coming from the other than human, I'm also really interested in thinking about language that is human, as it does become this incredibly potent point of accessibility and inclusivity if you allow it to be. And how can I utilize that in these kind of often speculative investigations? So moving on to the last area of interest within my practice, which is thinking about community and thinking about kind of knowledge sharing and experience making within these kind of community engaged art practices. So this is an area that I find is probably least present within this particular exhibition at SNAP. Although there was originally going to be an artist walk opposed to an artist talk, which would have been more kind of thinking through kind of the relationship to community and how the artwork kind of interacts with the community. But unfortunately, that's going to have to wait for another time. But thinking about community, the first place I often kind of dwell in is in printmaking, because printmaking is inherently community-based. It asks us to participate in community-based spaces. It asks us to work with or alongside others. It asks us to kind of participate with the mediums and processes that prioritizes kind of a cooperation with them in terms of how various assets and materials want to respond. They're going to respond the ways that they're kind of intended to, and how they want to express themselves. And printmaking is also sometimes intimidating. So the equipment and processes are fairly complex and whatnot. And the project that I wanted to talk to about thinking about kind of community engaged art practices is thinking about this kind of community minded experience, as well as what it means that when printmaking is seen as kind of intimidating, and how to remove that. So this was called Print Shop in a Box, and it's a collaboration between the Grenfell Art Gallery, the Makerspace, and the Print Shop. And we were able to make a portable and accessible print studio experience that is currently being mailed out, or almost ready to be mailed out, to rural communities across Newfoundland and Labrador. Kind of bringing a printmaking studio to the community, opposed to expecting community members to kind of come to these larger centralized city centers where the print studios typically take place. So each box contains a 3D printed press, and the press itself is an open access file from Open Press Projects, originally designed by a fellow named Martin Schneider out in Germany, that he made available online. And then we've since kind of added to the design and kind of changed things on it. So adding kind of our version of a captain's wheel and a letterpress edition that can be used on the press itself. And within the kit, there's also materials for up to 24 people to participate in a variety of workshops at a variety of skill levels. And this project was funded by the university as well as Canada Council, that has allowed us to create a year-long contract for someone to be the project coordinator. And when I think about community engaged art practices, I think about how can I contribute and utilize kind of my very privileged place within a university to create opportunities, specifically paid opportunities, for people to kind of take part in these things. So that was something that was really important to me. This project also has a zine that goes through its instructions and how to utilize the press in a variety of ways, that's currently being translated between English, French, and Mi'kmaq. And for a long time, I saw this project as a teaching collaboration or a teaching project. And recently I've started thinking about it as something that's not necessarily housed within this kind of category of teaching project, but something that is a part of my art practice. And specifically thinking about like, what does art look like when it prioritizes learning? And that's kind of led me to, I'll just kind of touch upon a project that I'm starting. And this is called A Slow Exchange, an Invitation and Incomplete Guide to Something, in this case, spoon carving. And it's kind of underneath this larger title of It's Okay Not to Be an Expert. So it's eventually what it's going to be, it's a lending library of zines where people will be able to kind of experience various things taught, and kind of creating community around thinking about what it means to prioritize the act of learning and the act of knowledge exchange within art practices over the kind of final product of something itself. So in this series of exhibitions and residencies, the thing will never really be shown. It'll just be the processes that are kind of shown, in the materials and the offcuts and the acts of learning that are kind of emphasized. So that's just something that's kind of on the back burner right now that there is kind of a small version of it shown at the Rooms Provincial Art Gallery in St. John's, but there'll be a couple of residencies coming up where I'm going to be exploring this further. So that kind of brings me to the end of the artist talk, thinking through those kind of three general interests. But I wanted to conclude it with a short text I wrote that I feel starts to speak towards these gestures of slowness that I participate in. And this is something that is, if you go to Snap, it's the text that's on the front windows. Here it's kind of seen in its incomplete state before it was fully vinyled up there. But the text goes, "A reminder for myself to learn to be here, to be present. Travel down the road, the gravel, now mud and grass, up onto the boulder. Try to move slow, think slow, slower still, now stop. Sit and wait, look and listen. It's okay to be noticed, as it's not easy to be as if never here. But only then will you allow your surroundings to return to their ways, to know how the robin may act when their alarm calls return to song. When you become slow enough to notice and be unnoticed, when looking and listening becomes seeing and hearing. But until then, remember, this task is difficult, as your body is hard to be made still and your mind is hard to ease, and it's always hard to be waiting." Thank you.